Hello and welcome to this video where we're going to be ranking every single species that's ever been in any of the Oddworld games. Although, if any species are introduced in Oddworld Soulstorm, we won't be talking about those ones just because I've not actually got around to replaying that at the time of recording this video. As well as that, we're not going to be talking about any of the Oddworld species that aren't actually in the games themselves, because with them not being in the games, I can't really rank them properly. There's quite a few creatures that are only in the art books, or that were cut from the final games, so we're not going to be talking about those ones. Even without talking about them though, we've got a lot to get through, so let's crack on with it and head over to the webcam version of me. Let's go. So here we are, you join me at the computer where we're going to be using one of these tier list templates to rank every single Oddworld species. I've actually made this template, so if there are any species missing, that's on me. But let me know in the comments if you can think of any that I don't talk about in this video. I'm pretty sure that I've got them all. But let's see. But anyway, with that out of the way, let's crack on with it, shall we? So the first Oddworld species that we're taking a look at is the Madokans. And just straight away, I'm not going to beat around the bush with this, they're going straight into the S tier. The reason for that is that they're by far the most relatable species out of any of them, with them being sort of like the equivalent of humans. Other than that though, they serve a really important purpose with the gameplay as well. Obviously in the first Oddworld game it was fairly rudimentary, you just had to rescue them all and do a few puzzles by like keeping the Madokans safe that are following you. But in Exodus they really stepped it up, and the Madokans could have like different emotions that impacted the gameplay slightly differently. And then even in Munch's Odyssey, the Madokans were expanded to be able to take part in combat in different ways as well. So yeah, both in terms of lore and in terms of gameplay, I would say that the Madokans are way up there. Next up we kind of have the opposite of the Madokans with the Glukkons. Now, these are basically the main antagonists in all of the Oddworld games that we've seen so far, or at least most of them. And these are like the crazy industrialists that will stop at nothing just to make a profit, and they're slowly destroying the planet of Oddworld to do that. But yeah, these make for really good villains. In the first game, we really only got to know one particular Glukkon. There were others in the background, but they didn't get really much screen time. So yeah, Moloch the Glukkon in the first game was kind of just this like really kind of scary presence. But then in Abe's Exodus, again they expanded it, and you could actually even possess Glukkons in that game who could use Sligs to do the bidding. But as well as that, we had some really good Glukkon characters with Vice President Aslik, General Drippic and Director Flegg. All of them sort of had different personalities and they bounced off of each other really well. So yeah, the Glukkons, again, they're going in S rank. Just like the Madokans, the Glukkons are really good from the perspective of both gameplay and the story. Then we move on to Scrabs, which are probably one of the main recognisable enemies in the Oddworld games. They're featured quite early on in Abe's Odyssey, so I wouldn't be surprised if most people had come across one of these. So Scrabs are kind of a little bit more animalistic than some of the other Oddworld species in the way that they will just attempt to kill you as soon as they see you. But Scrabs have this really interesting mechanic to them where when there's more than one on the screen at the same time, they prioritise fighting each other over killing you. So it's like the Scrabs are always in this fight for dominance with each other, and they are kind of more lone wolves than some of the other creatures that we see. So yeah, not only is that interesting from a gameplay point of view, because you obviously need to get Scrabs to kill each other at certain points, but also it's really interesting how the Oddworld games always used this mixture of like having something to do with the lore, like Scrabs being lone wolves, but then they actually make these gameplay scenarios around that. I think that that's something that the early Oddworld games did really well actually. So yeah, I don't really think there's anywhere other than S rank for Scrabs to go. Because Scrabs are lone wolves, they don't really have their own version of GameSpeak, So in Abe's Exodus, when you can possess them, it's actually like fairly rudimentary what you can do with them, because you basically just use them to attack other creatures and that's about it. So I guess if there was one criticism of the Scrabs, it would be that I kinda wish that the possession in Abe's Exodus would have been a little bit more fleshed out. But I still feel like they belong in S. So now we're moving on to the most recognisable Oddworld enemy, which is the Slig. These are just really cool from a visual point of view, with them having the mechanical legs, the machine guns, and also the masks, which have always hidden the faces, so we don't actually know what they look like under there. But as well as that, they've also got the like sort of fingers that it like kind of hides their mouths. But the fingers are all like close together and kind of look like they've been broken and they're all floppy. I've always really liked that. There's a few like Oddworld designs that resemble hands, one of which we're coming up to in a minute. But yeah, the Sligs, they've got to go in S rank. As well as them just looking really cool and being really threatening as well, because they can kill you in literally one shot because they're all holding guns. They also have their own version of GameSpeak, which allows them to talk to slugs, which I always thought was really cool. This isn't really something that's utilised a whole lot, but whenever it is, I always really enjoyed it, like just with them being able to control these little dog creatures that have been chasing you through the whole game. It kind of like adds another spin onto the complexity of this like relationship between these two species. But anyway, let's move on now and talk about the Paramites. Now, I've always actually preferred the Paramites to the Scrabs personally, and I just think that the Paramites have a little bit more going on. So basically the Paramites are the exact opposite of the Scrabs. So whereas the Scrabs are safe to be around if there's two or more of them, the Paramites are the opposite in the way that they actually become a lot more deadly if there's two or more of them. To the point where if there's only one of them, you can actually just kind of like stand next to them and you'll be completely safe. That is so long as you don't back them up against a wall and make them feel threatened. But yeah, in Abe's Exodus especially, you get to actually possess the Paramites, and that's where you learn that they can actually like communicate with each other in quite complex ways. Like they can get other Paramites to follow them and get them to attack other creatures with them as well. But as well as that, they're also really agile, so you use the Paramites in some of these really cool platforming sections, which again you never really do with the Scrabs. So yeah, I just feel like the Paramites are potentially a little bit cooler personally. Also, their visual design is really cool. Again, like the Sligs, they've got the sort of like hand for a face, but whereas the Sligs is all broken and floppy, the Paramites is actually like still a functional hand that looks really strong, and it makes them really expressive too. So yeah, based on all of this, I mean, I've definitely got to put Paramites in S rank. I know that we haven't actually put one of these species anywhere lower than S at the moment, but I really do think that these 5 species in particular are probably the 5 best in the entire franchise. But yeah, now let's move on to a bit of a weird one with the Meeches. So the Meeches are interesting because we've actually never seen one in any of the games, and that's because the Meeches have been made extinct, with Rupture Farms having hunted them to the point where there's none left. And that happened before the events of Abe's Odyssey. So, although we've never seen one alive, what the Meeches do is they introduce this like concept that Rupture Farms is literally destroying entire species because it's like over hunting them. So I think that really like grounds it a little bit because it makes the threat of Rupture Farms seem all the more real. Like if you just let them get away with what they're doing, not only are they going to take down the Scrabs and Paramites, but they will also eventually make the Madokans extinct as well. So it really like ups the ante in terms of the threat that the Glukkons represent. Other than that, I just really like the whole mystery surrounding the Meeches as well, because obviously with us never having seen one in the games, we don't actually clearly know what they look like. So I've always thought that maybe it would be interesting if we did eventually see one, maybe in like a prequel game or something, but at the same time that would kind of ruin the mystery of the thing. So despite us having never actually seen the Meeches, I'm still going to rank them fairly highly just because I think that they serve an important purpose in the overall Oddworld lore, particularly with the first game. So I'm going to put Meeches in B, I reckon. Now we're moving on to a little bit of a weird one, because this is the bats that are found in Oddworld Abe's Odyssey, and also in New and Tasty as well, with that being a remake of the first game. Now, I've never really particularly liked the bats. Not only are they a little bit difficult to get around because they literally one-hit you, and they're always placed in these really difficult platforming sections, but also they are literally just bats, just like a regular bat that you would see on Earth. Because of that, I've always kind of thought that they were a little bit sort of bland, but I guess it does serve kind of a purpose because it's sort of like implying that the atmosphere of Oddworld is very similar to the one on Earth. So it like kind of sets up the world as being like this easily relatable mirror image of our own world, if you get what I mean. So yeah, it makes sense that some of the species would be the same as the ones found on our planet, but I kinda do feel like maybe it would have been interesting if they looked a little bit more Oddworldy. As well as that, the bats don't really have any mechanical depth in terms of the gameplay. Like I say, they're more so there as an obstacle as opposed to an actual enemy. So I think this is the first one that we're going to put in D. It's not that I absolutely hate them or anything, but they are quite forgettable. So yeah, I think that explains my opinion on the bats. Now we're moving on to actually a very similar situation, because now we're talking about the bees. And although the bees are similar to the bats in the way that they are just bees, so they're the same as the bees that we find on this planet, I feel like they do have a little bit more going on in terms of the gameplay. So, first of all, whenever Abe goes near one, a swarm of bees chases him, so it kind of adds this, like, fast-paced platforming into the game, which hasn't really been seen too much before the bees are introduced. But as well as that, you can actually throw a rock at the bee's hive, and it knocks it to the floor and releases a load of bees, and you can basically use this to like kill paramites and stuff as a sort of puzzle. So yeah, I just think they're a little bit more mechanically complex than the bats, which makes them more interesting to come across. As well as that, another gameplay mechanic attached to these is that when you're with Elum, Elum loves honey, so you need to do this thing where whenever you come across a bee's nest and it's dripping honey, you need to find a way of like snapping Elum out of his honey trance so that he gets focused again and you can progress through the game. And I always thought that was quite interesting. I always liked that element of it as well. So yeah, despite them being a little bit basic in terms of the design, they are way better than the bats, so I think I'm going to put the bees in C. Next up, we're moving on to a really interesting one, because technically this one isn't featured in any of the games, but it also technically is. So this right here is called the Shrink, and the only time that you can ever actually see this thing is if you 100% the original Abe's Odyssey by rescuing all of the Madokans, and that unlocks a cutscene viewer. And if you go down to the list of cutscenes, you can view one that isn't actually featured in the game at all, and it's actually an advert for the game. And within this advert is the only time that the Shrink is ever seen. And it's basically this computer monitor with a Madokan's face on it, and attached to the monitor is all of these different spider legs that all have different, like, doctor's utensils attached to them. And the background lore with this thing is that it's basically used to motivate Madokans. And yeah, by that I think the implication is that it basically tortures them to get to work. Which is pretty dark and messed up, and the advert itself is extremely scary. So yeah, I really like this thing. I think if we ever saw this in one of the actual games, it would need to be this like really terrifying entity in order to do it justice. But yeah, I really, really would like to see an Oddworld game that went for something a little bit more, like, dark with its tone, and the Shrink could be used as an enemy in that game. But for now, it kind of exists as this sort of, like, mysterious thing that, like, whenever you watch this cutscene, it doesn't feel like you're supposed to be watching it, and I think that adds to the whole, like, creepiness of the situation. So yeah, I'm actually going to go ahead and put this one in S. I mean, technically you could argue that this thing isn't even a species because it's a robot, but I'm gonna count it because I just think it's really cool. Next up, we're moving on to yet another species that technically isn't actually a species, and this is the Shrikal. And this is more of like a sort of like, I guess you could describe it as a god, or just like an entity. And this is what Abe gets the ability to turn into during the events of Abe's Odyssey. And he uses this to shut down Rupture Farms. But the thing is with the Shrikal is that I've always felt sort of like the games released after Abe's Odyssey didn't really do very much with this concept. So like, while it is found in Abe's Exodus, it's used very sparingly, and it's just used in the exact same way that it was in the first game, where when you chant you just destroy everything on the screen. But I kind of feel like maybe they could have done something a little bit different with it, like maybe it could have given Abe the ability to like do like a really fast sprint forward or like jump really high or something, so that you could use it in different ways to get around the environment. I don't know. Especially in Oddworld Munch's Odyssey, it isn't even featured in that game at all. Which doesn't really make any sense, because if Abe has the ability to do this, why wouldn't he use it more frequently? I don't know, but yeah. Despite it being a bit underutilized in some of the later games, I do still really like it. Visually it's really cool, with it being like this half Scrab, half Paramite hybrid. So yeah, although I do like it, I just feel like I can't put it any higher than C. Just because I feel like it's a little bit underutilized. But next up, we're moving on to one of my favourite species with Elum. Again, there's this ongoing joke in my videos where I'm not sure if Elum is the name of this particular character or whether Elum is the name of the overall species. And to be honest, I don't think the Oddworld inhabitants even know which one it is either, because they, like, maybe it is an Elum, like the species Elum, and its name is Elum, because I think that would get around a lot of the different, like, mistakes Oddworld inhabitants have made in the way that they, like, talk about Elum. Because sometimes they use it as a term to refer to the species, and sometimes they use it as a way of referring to this particular Elum. So yeah, maybe it's an Elum called Elum. But anyway, that aside, I really like this thing. Again, it's only featured in Abe's Odyssey, which I always thought was really weird. I'm very surprised it didn't make an appearance in Abe's Exodus. It was kind of replaced, I guess, by the minecart in that game, with that being like the only sort of vehicle that Abe uses. But yeah, I really think that Stranger's Wrath should have had like a more western version of Elum, that the stranger could have rode around on in these like more open world sections. I think that would have been really cool. And plus they could have done some really interesting visual stuff by making the Elum look slightly different. But even so, I do think that in the first game, Elum is used really well. Like I said earlier when we were talking about the bees, there's these bits where Elum gets obsessed by honey and you need to snap him out of it. And also you can use the game speak with Elum to get him to follow you and wait and stuff, which is used in a variety of different situations. But the main way that you use Elum is by riding him, sort of like a camel. And when you're doing this, you can move way faster and jump way further. And it's used in some of these really like intense platforming sections. They actually added more of those sections into New and Tasty as well, I guess just because they knew that people liked it in the original. So yeah, I'm going to put Elum in A. Elum is going to be the first creature that we put in A. And the only reason that he's not going in S is just because he's only featured in the first game, which is very upsetting. Next up we've got a creature that's actually very similar to the bees and the bats from earlier, but this time we're talking about birds. Now, again, like those two creatures before, the birds aren't really a species, at least in terms of the gameplay, and they're more so just like something that Abe can interact with. Because basically the bird portals are just what you use to rescue the Madokans, and sometimes you can enter the portals yourself to teleport around. But yeah, because of that I can't really properly rank these as a species, but once again visually they are just birds, there's nothing like inherently Oddworld about them. But I like the symbolism with this. I like the symbolism involved with the birds, because whenever Abe dies, he turns into a bunch of birds, and then the birds all come together to resurrect him when you, like, respawn at the checkpoint. And I've always really liked that. Like, the whole thing where, like, Abe is like a caged bird trying to escape from all of these different situations. So, I think maybe just because of the whole symbolism element of this, I am going to put birds above bats, and I think I'm going to put them in C. Now I'm looking at this, I'm thinking I'm going to move the Shrikal up one, because, come on, the Shrikal is better than the bees and the birds, right? So I think I was harsh on the Shrikal before. I'm gonna move the Shrikal up to B with Meeches. Next up we're talking about the last species that was introduced in Abe's Odyssey. Probably should have said that at the top of this video, but the way that we're going through all of these different creatures is game by game, so all of the ones that we've ranked so far were introduced in Abe's Odyssey. And next up we're going to move on to Abe's Exodus, and onwards. But yeah, the last one in Abe's Odyssey is actually the Slug. Now I really do like these. Like the Scrabs, they're a little bit more simple because they are just a creature that will spot you, run at you and kill you. There's nothing kind of more complex about them. But these things do look really threatening, and with them resembling dogs, and they even bark like dogs and stuff, again, it gives you that, like, interesting parallel between our own world and Oddworld. In fact, I think that the slugs do this better than, like, the bees, bats, and birds, because the slugs are basically the equivalent of a dog, but they don't look anything like a dog, really. So, like, I like that. I prefer the way that the slugs resemble dogs, as opposed to the bees, bats, and birds just looking like bees, bats, and birds, if you get what I mean. But yeah, another interesting thing with the slugs is that the Sligs can talk to them and get them to, like, attack other Sligs and stuff, which I've always really liked. I do kind of feel like I wish that that was built upon a little bit, because although there are some, like, short sections where you possess a Slig who then talks to a slug, I kind of feel it would have been interesting if there was a prolonged section where you played as a Slig, and, like, you had this slug constantly following you, and it kind of, like, built up a relationship between these two characters, which would then obviously end in disaster, probably with them both getting killed. But yeah, if they did that right, I feel like that could have been a really cool section, but they never really do that. But either way, I still feel like the slugs are good enough to be ranked really high, and I think I'm gonna put the slugs in, I think, A, just because they're a little bit better than the Shrikal because they've got a little bit more going on gameplay-wise, and I think that that's the main reason I want to put them above the Shrikal. So now, we're moving on to the creatures that debuted in Abe's Exodus, the second game. So first up, we're starting off the list very, very high up because we've got a flying Slig. Now, a disclaimer here. Flying Sligs are technically the exact same species as the regular Sligs that we talked about earlier, and the only difference is the fact that rather than having mechanical legs, these ones have propeller packs. But in terms of the actual creature, it's the same. But still, I feel like they're different enough in terms of gameplay to separate them. But yeah, these things were introduced in Abe's Exodus, and when you possess one, you just get a way better sense of verticality because obviously they can fly, and that opens the game up to allowing you to like more freely move around, and there's these bits where you need to like dodge out of the way of drills and stuff, which was always really cool. But as well as that, they can also throw grenades, which not only makes them really dangerous to come across when you're just playing as Abe, but it also makes you feel really powerful when you do possess one, because you can basically quite easily kill anything in your path. But yeah, I do really like these, and I really like how Exodus introduced this concept where the Sligs were being used in all sorts of like wacky ways. I always really liked that, and I always kind of wished that we saw a little bit more variety with the different machines that the Sligs were using. But yeah, I'm definitely going to be putting this flying Sligs in A. They're not quite as good as regular Sligs, to be honest, because they don't really have any element of game speak. In fact, you know what would have been really cool, and I'm surprised they didn't do this? There was never a bit where you controlled a slug as a flying Slig. I feel like that could have been used really interestingly, but they never did that for some reason. Next up, we're staying with the theme of Sligs, and this time we're talking about the crawling Slig. Now, the crawling Slig is kind of just a Slig. Like, this is what a Slig looks like when it's not got any mechanical legs, propeller pack, or any other enhancements. I guess the only kind of mechanical thing it does have is the mask. But yeah, other than that, this is pretty much just what a Slig is. And I think Exodus did a really interesting thing with this, because for the entire game, you've been seeing the Sligs as being this really, like, aggressive and dangerous species, but then all of a sudden you come to this section where you first witness what they actually are, and they're just like crawling across the floor yelling for help. And it really does put the like emphasis on the fact that the only reason the Sligs have been a threat is because they've been given these mechanical upgrades by the Glukkons. I always thought that that was really interesting, and they don't really tend to dwell on it too much. But yeah, despite me really liking the crawling Sligs for everything like that it does, I do think that in terms of gameplay they're really underutilized, because whenever you come across one, they basically just run to the nearest machine in order to get the mechanical legs or a propeller pack. So you don't actually see them in this state very often or for very long. And an interesting thing that I think that they could have done with this is when you were controlling a regular Slig, there could have been moments where you could have ejected yourself from the mechanical legs, and this sort of like acted as like a one-time jump. But if you use this jump, you obviously turn back into a crawling Slig, and then you're completely unable to defend yourself. So it's like this trade-off of having this one jump, but then if you use it, you need to like crawl to the nearest machine to get access to more legs or a propeller pack. And I think this would have been interesting as well, because then there could have been a section where you actually played as a Slig for a really long time, and you could have been like jumping from mechanical legs to propeller packs, you could have been like talking to slugs, all in like one seamless gameplay section. I think that would have been really cool, and it's a kind of a shame that we never saw that. But anyway, we're getting a little bit off topic. So, crawling Sligs, little bit underutilized in terms of gameplay, but I do like the whole thing where it kind of like subverts your expectations because you see the Slig species for what it actually is. So for that reason, I think I'm going to put crawling Sligs in B. If you think crawling Sligs were pathetic though, next up we're moving on to potentially the most pathetic Oddworld creature with the Slurg. So basically what the Slurgs are these little purple slugs, and they're literally killed by Abe just when he steps on them. But the thing is with these is that when you do step on them, they let out a loud squeak that wakes up any nearby creatures and alerts them to your position. So although they themselves aren't a threat, they do kind of cause a threat by them being loud when you step on them. These are only really ever used in the Necrom section of Abe's Exodus, but yeah, I kind of like that because it kind of like reinforces this idea that certain creatures are like sort of native to certain areas. And it just makes the world feel a little bit more like believable because of that. So yeah, they kind of have this interesting gameplay element, and from a lore perspective they're a little bit interesting because of that. But they aren't the best. They're probably one of the weaker Oddworld characters. So I guess I'm gonna put these in D, to be honest, just because they're a little bit kind of forgettable, and they're just not that great. But now we're moving on to a similar sized creature, but one that presents much more of a threat and is used quite a lot more in Abe's Exodus as well, because this is the Fleech. And the Fleeches are basically these green worms that have this really long tongue, and if they attack you enough times, they'll just swallow you whole. Which is kind of disturbing to witness, to be honest, because they're really tiny, and yet somehow they can fit an entire Madokan into them in one gulp as well. So yeah, kinda gross, but I like it. In terms of the ways that these are used in the gameplay itself, I actually think that these are used in a really interesting way, despite the fact that you can't possess them and play as them. But what these do, these are actually kind of a rare case of an enemy that doesn't actually one-hit kill you. And this can make certain sections feel really tense, because if there's like a Fleech hot on your tail and it's attacking you quite a lot, you know that like in one more hit it might just insta-kill you and swallow you. So yeah, whenever you come across these it can be quite like tense. But as well, they're also used in these really cool like timed sections. Like there's this one really memorable bit where the Fleeches are slowly getting released by these gates, and you have to go through this whole like drill section in order to get to some Madokans and rescue them before the Fleeches are fully released and you're all inevitably killed by them. So yeah, I think the Fleeches add this like tension element to all of these different situations that I really like. So I think I'm going to put the Fleeches in B. I do really appreciate what they do for those sections that they're in. Now we're moving on to another fully mechanical species, so it technically isn't a species at all. But because it's used quite a lot, particularly in the later sections of the game, I feel like I still need to count this on the list. So this is a greeter. And in terms of the lore and the history with this species, I just really like the idea of these. So basically they were originally made to be like these tour guides that were like really friendly and would like take you around places like the Fico depot and just generally give you a tour of the place. But since the Glukkons have become like sort of more insidious, they've repurposed them to be security guards. So they've still got this like massive smile from when they were tour guides, but now they're these like killing machines that will just like instantly spot you and electrocute you on sight. I always really liked how like kind of twisted that was. As well as that, I also like how these things have the exact same like voices as Sligs, but it's just like pitched slightly differently, so it's almost like the greeters are trying to imitate what the Sligs are. I always thought that that was a really like sort of creepy detail, almost like the greeters were somewhat sentient. So yeah, despite the greeters, you can't possess them or anything, so they don't have like too much complexity, and they don't respond to any form of game speak either. But in terms of just like the whole like history of them, I really do like these things. So, you know, I'm actually going to put the greeters, I think it's between A and B, and I'm kind of swaying more towards B because I think they're on the sort of same level as the Fleech, to be honest. Next up, we're talking about the last species that was introduced in Abe's Exodus, and this might just look like a picture of 3 slugs, and that's because it is. And the reason that it's a picture of 3 slugs is because it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to find a high quality render of what's referred to as a sloggy. Now the sloggies are literally the same species as the slugs, only they're the puppy versions. So in Abe's Exodus they're literally just like these downscaled slog sprites, but the voices are like pitched higher up so they sound more puppyish. And while you could say that that's lazy, I just think it's funny, like, because what else would a puppy slog look like? It would just look like a smaller slog, right? So it makes sense to just downscale the sprites. But yeah, these things aren't really used all that much in Abe's Exodus. and they don't really have too much complexity either. They're basically exactly the same as slugs. But if you time a jump well, you can actually jump over them and like get around them to escape. I don't think the game ever actually forces you to do this, but it's still interesting that you actually can do that if you time it well. But in terms of like kind of what they do, they're just like a shallower version of what a slug is, I guess. So because of that, I think I'm going to put these things... I think I'm going to put them in C. It's nice that we get to see what a baby slug looks like, but it doesn't really add anything to the game particularly, other than getting a little bit of a chuckle out of it. So now we're moving on to all of the creatures that made their first appearance in Oddworld Munch's Odyssey, which is a game in the series that I really don't like. Although I do appreciate certain elements of it, it's just the gameplay really lets the whole thing down, and also the fact that it was quite clearly rushed, meaning that the story feels a lot shallower and just far less detailed than what Abe's Odyssey and Exodus did. So yeah, despite that though, it did introduce some really good Oddworld species, and it's almost a shame that we've not seen any of these in any of the later games. Because I feel like they really didn't get the chance to shine in Munch's Odyssey, so I'd like to see a lot of these get a second shot. But the first species we're talking about is none other than the one that Munch belongs to, which is the Gabbit. And you know what? For how much I don't like Munch's Odyssey, I really do like Munch as a character. I just really like the fact that he's almost even more innocent and childlike than what Abe is, and that just instantly makes us like him. But then as well, because the introduction cutscene is like so sad, because it just details how Munch has lost his family, and later in the game you learn that he's lost his entire species and is the last remaining Gabbit. But yeah, it's just so sad watching him just like hop around crying and just like looking for like his friends and his family who have all been killed. Yeah, it's pretty dark, but it does make us instantly like Munch, and we instantly like feel an emotional connection to him. So for that reason, I really do think that the Gabbits as a whole need to be ranked like fairly high. It's a shame that we never got to see any more Gabbits outside of Munch. I think there's this one bit in the introduction cutscene that's like a flashback where you get to see some swimming around, but you never get to see any of them in any real detail. So we're kind of basing the entire species off what we know about Munch here. But yeah, I really like him, and I'm gonna rank him quite high here, you know, because he does have quite a lot of mechanical complexity too, because he can talk to Fuzzles and like get them to follow him and attack other creatures and stuff. And also there's the thing where he's like really slow on land, but he can swim really well, which introduces this interesting dynamic between Abe and Munch, because Abe literally can't swim. So it's like the two characters are much better suited to different situations. Although the game doesn't really ever utilise that particularly well, I still think that that's an interesting concept. So I'm going to put the Gabbit species in A, actually, because I do like them, even if they're in a little bit of a rubbish game. But next up we've got the real highlight of Munch's Odyssey, because now we're talking about the main antagonists from that game, which are the Vikas. And I'm so annoyed that the Vikas have never had a real, like, major appearance outside of Munch's Odyssey, because I honestly think that they're the creepiest, and I would go as far as to say best villains that the series have ever seen. They're genuinely really scary, like, even more so than what the Glukkons are, just because of how absolutely demented they are. They're basically these like crazy scientist doctor type characters that create like pharmaceutical products to sell to the inhabitants of Oddworld. But in order to like make these products, they do like experiments and operations on creatures, basically just to learn how they tick. And yeah, these operations can be basically carried out really brutally, and a lot of the time for literally no reason. So they basically just treat all of the critters that they capture as test subjects, and it's quite horrific. And I think there's a couple of times in Munch's Odyssey where this really comes to the forefront. One of them is at the beginning, where they capture Munch and implant this like sonar into his skull. And then in the bad ending of the game as well, where they literally just like cut into Munch's torso to remove his lungs, which obviously like instantly kills him. So yeah, the Vikas are pretty dark, probably the darkest enemies we've ever seen in any Oddworld game, which is a little bit weird considering that Munch's Odyssey in general is the most light-hearted Oddworld game. But I almost think that that kind of adds to it, because that kind of makes them seem even more sinister. Because it's like, what would they be doing if they were in an already dark game? You know what I mean? Like, just how twisted can they get? So yeah, I'm gonna put the Vikas in S rank. I really like them, and I just really want to see them in a newer Oddworld game where they can really be explored a little bit more, in a lot more depth. I really want to see that. Next up we have the Fuzzles, and although the designs of these is maybe a little bit sort of lazy, like it's just a little bit boring compared to a lot of the stuff that we've seen. Like when you compare them side by side with like a Vika, for example, they're just a lot more basic. Like it's basically just a fur ball with sharp teeth and obviously two massive eyes. But yeah, these things are still kinda cool. They're basically, I guess the joke with this is that you spot them and you think like, oh, they look really cute, but then they turn out to be like really vicious. Potentially because the Vikas have been doing so many experiments on them, they're just really vicious as like a self-defense mechanism. But yeah, these things actually befriend Munch, and one of the objectives anyway of Munch's Odyssey becomes to rescue as many Fuzzles as possible. Because so many of them have been captured by the Vikas. But yeah, I've never really liked these too much. So I think I'm going to put these ones in, I think I'm going to put them in C. There's not really like too much to talk about with them because it's not really like they ever got much like exploration. It's kind of like they were set up as being the things to rescue, but they don't really do anything outside of that like the Madokans do. Like the Madokans have this whole like society and they've built temples and stuff. They've got all of these different like social classes and things like that, but the Fuzzles don't really have that going on, which by comparison just kind of makes them a little bit more boring. Now we're moving on to the Interns, and for a long time actually I thought that these were the same species as the Vikas, but just like a sort of lower version of them. But now that I look at it, they are definitely different species. But what's kind of creepy about these is the fact that the Vikas have quite clearly done like experiments on them, and they've like stitched their mouths shut so that they can't communicate with each other, I guess, and cause like some sort of intern uprising. But obviously the thing with this is that Abe has his mouth stitched shut, right? But the difference here is that the Interns, it's kind of not just their mouth that's been stitched shut, it's like their entire mouth has been removed and their noses have been removed, and they've had the two sides of their face stretched together and then stitched shut. So it's kind of a lot more gruesome, and the game doesn't really ever show this in any detail. But that's probably for the best, because if we actually saw this operation taking place, it probably would be very grim. But even so, I actually do like these. I guess I like the idea of them more than I actually like them, because in terms of their design, they maybe do look a little bit simple, and maybe they do look a little bit too similar to the Vikas as well. But I just like the idea of there being this species that the Vikas have sort of like done experiments on, and like forced them to like act as these like bodyguards for them. I just like the whole concept of that. I think that's interesting. So I'm gonna put the Interns in C. I like them, but I kind of wish that they had a little bit more screen time and a little bit more development. And now we're moving on to the first Oddworld species that I would go as far as to say that I outright hate. This is the Big Bro Slig. And I just think that this looks a little bit stupid. Obviously we've had different versions of the Sligs, like we've had the regular Slig with the mechanical legs, we've had flying Sligs with a propeller pack, and the crawling Sligs, which is what the Sligs actually are. But with those, they were all just a regular Slig, only with a different, like, mechanical enhancement. So it still felt believable and like it could actually happen. But the difference with the Big Bro Slig is that the Slig itself is a lot bigger and just like buffer, like it's been taking steroids or something. Which might actually be the point, because Munch's Odyssey obviously has this theme of like the Vikas doing like body modifications and stuff and like transforming things into things that they're not supposed to be. So maybe that was done on purpose, maybe it looks kind of stupid on purpose because it's like the Vikas have been experimenting on Sligs. But the game never actually says that. So if that would have been like a scene, I might have liked them a little bit more. But because that's not ever actually like said or like even implied in the game at all, they just end up looking a little bit stupid. And one of my issues with all of the enemies in Munch's Odyssey is that no matter how big they are, no matter what they look like, they all act the same. Every enemy either just runs at you and attacks you at close range, or shoots at you from long range, no matter if it's a Slig, a Paramite, a Scrab, an Intern, a Big Bro Slig, whatever. Every enemy is just functionally exactly the same, and I've always hated that. That's one of the things that I really dislike about Munch's Odyssey, because it just gets rid of any of that complexity that the Scrabs and Paramites and everything else had in Abe's Odyssey and Exodus, and it just makes the world feel so much less believable. And that is the thing that I hate about the Big Bro Sligs, they just don't feel believable to me. Like, I don't believe that a Slig could be that big. And I just think it ends up looking a bit silly. I don't know why they didn't come up with like another species that could have been like the big brute character. I feel like that might have worked a little bit better. So, the Big Bro Slig, I am putting an F. I really, really don't like it. Next up, we're moving on to a weird Oddworld character with the Meep. And Meeps are basically sheep that have, I think, one eye and have like got a slightly deformed face. And my issue with these things is that they're just hardly ever even seen in the game, but even when they are seen, they're just used in such a like bare bones way. They're used more so as just like a collectible as opposed to an actual creature, because I think the one time that these are actually used in Munch's Odyssey is where you need to pick up like a lot of them and throw them into this pen to like herd them all together. And I just think that that's really boring. They could have been used so much more interestingly. I don't know what they could have done to make them stand out more, but they definitely could have done something with this that wasn't just, oh, go over there, pick them up and throw them over here. I just feel like that's kind of lazy, to be honest. So, yet again, this is 2 in a row now. I'm gonna put the Meep in F. There's just not a lot to say about them, to be honest. They're just boring, very, very forgettable, and their designs aren't even really all that good to look at either. And now we have yet another species from Munch's Odyssey that I really don't like. This is the almighty raisin, which I assume might belong to a species called the raisins, but the almighty raisin is the only one that we've ever seen, so I guess there might only be this one left. But this is basically this like sort of sage-like character that appears at the beginning of Munch's Odyssey and basically sends Abe on his quest to rescue Munch, and then later tells Abe and Munch to go and get the last can of Gabbits, which is what the game is actually about. But the thing that I don't like about this is that the almighty raisin wasn't in Abe's Exodus at all, and at the end of Abe's Exodus, Abe sort of like finds himself and like starts believing that he could actually save the Madokan species and like cause this uprising. So he sort of becomes the master of his own destiny at the end of Abe's Exodus. But then Munch's Odyssey kind of just like throws this out of the window, because then Abe is just suddenly reporting to this big raisin that we've never seen before, and it's just not very well introduced to us. It just like randomly appears in the first cutscene, and just like it comes out of nowhere. And I think that like sort of disparity between the two games has always really led me to heavily dislike this character. So I am going to put the Almighty Raisin in F. I just think it doesn't make any sense. It takes away from the ending of Abe's Exodus a little bit as well, which I really don't like. And yeah, I think it's quite a forgettable character as well, because outside of appearing at the beginning of the game, I don't think it ever appears again. So yeah, kind of forgettable, not really used all that interestingly, and causes a little bit of a continuity issue between the second and third games too. The last creature introduced in Oddworld Munch's Odyssey is called a rat, and I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of you had completely forgotten that this species actually exists. And that's because I don't think it's actually seen in the gameplay, and it's only seen in cutscenes. I know that it appears in the introduction cutscene just as Munch gets captured. You see a couple of these scuttling around in the background. But these basically just get absolutely no, like, lore about them. They don't get, like, explained. They don't have, like, any gameplay mechanic attached to them because they're not actually in the game. And because of that, I honestly think that this is potentially one of the worst species in any Oddworld game, just because it kind of feels like they were thrown into the cutscenes just to give them a little bit more, like, movement or something, I guess, but they just didn't do anything else with them. So yeah, they don't really feel like a proper Oddworld species. They feel more so just like a decoration to make the cutscenes look a bit fancier. So because of that, I'm going to put these in F. Now this is where we move on to all of the species that were introduced in Oddworld Stranger's Wrath, which was the fourth game. And these creatures are all quite dramatically different because Stranger's Wrath was set in a completely different place to where the other games were. So because of that, we get to see a lot more diversity in the species. And so let's start this by taking a look at the Clackers. So the Clackers are basically these, like, big humanoid chickens. Almost like, I guess, like a mutated chicken that is obviously a lot more intelligent than a regular chicken. And these are basically like the farm people that live out in the country of the Old West. They speak with, like, these, like, countrified American accents and stuff, so they're actually quite, like, stereotypical, to be honest. But yeah, these basically serve the purpose of being the main NPCs that you come across in all of the, like, towns that you explore. And yeah, I do kind of have a soft spot for these, but there is something about them that kind of feels a little bit strange. Like, because none of the Oddworld creatures really, like, resemble a normal animal. Like, yeah, the slugs kind of look and act like dogs, but really they don't look anything like a dog. I guess the Slurgs look like slugs, but they're such like a minor character that doesn't really count. But now all of a sudden we have these, like, big mutated chickens, and it just doesn't really feel like something that would be in an Oddworld game. But I guess at the same time that does kind of add to the whole thing where it completely, like, makes it obvious from the off that we're not in the same place as we were in the other Oddworld games. So I guess it does kind of work, but just something about this rubs me the wrong way. So I'm going to put the Clackers in... I'm going to put them in D, I think, just because I would rather them have not looked like big chickens. I would rather them have come up with something more kind of unique. And case in point is this next species we're talking about, which are called Grubs. And this is the sort of thing I'm talking about. Like, these things don't really resemble anything that we've got on our own planet. They kind of look a little bit like frogs, I guess, but not so much so that they just look like a big mutated frog, if that makes sense. They actually look kinda similar to Madokans, and I wouldn't be surprised if these two species were, like, somewhat distantly related. But the Grubs basically act as, like, the natives of Stranger's Wrath. and a lot of them have been dying due to the industrialization in the area, and the late portions of the game become about rescuing this group or this species from everything going on with Secto and the dam that he's building. So yeah, I actually do kind of like these, and I also like how there's some bits earlier in the game where you come across these like ruins, and it's sort of like implied that there's another species here or was here in the past. And then later on in the game it's revealed that the Grubs are behind the like buildings that we saw earlier. I think that that's quite interesting. I feel like the game could have like explored that element a little bit more. But yeah, I think the Grubs are definitely better than the Clackers. But because the Grubs are only properly introduced to us quite late on, I feel like they're a little bit unmemorable because of that. I kind of feel like if they were to be featured in another Oddworld game and were introduced earlier, they might stand out a little bit more. But they are still good for what they're worth, definitely better than the Clackers. So I'm going to put them in C. But now we move on to the Strangers species, which, if you don't know, is called the Steef. And just like with the Gabbits from Munch's Odyssey, the Steef have been hunted almost to the point of extinction, and the Stranger could be the last of his species left. The Steef are really interesting because they're actually like really like physically capable, and it's really the first time that we've played as a character like that in an Oddworld game, because obviously while Abe is reasonably agile, he's almost like he's kind of only as agile as a regular human would be, whereas the Stranger is almost superhuman in what he can do. Like, he's really good at climbing, he's really fast, he can defend himself because he's created a crossbow that's mounted to his arm and stuff. So yeah, it's a very different experience. What I really like about the Stranger, and I guess the Steef as a whole, is how he goes through this like quite dramatic character arc, where at the start of the game he's kind of just like on his own, just trying to survive, just for survival's sake, I guess. But then later in the game he sort of like finds a new purpose and decides that he wants to use all of these like physical advantages he has to help other people. So yeah, with the Stranger really being the only Steef that we properly get to know, I'm kind of basing the entire species on the Stranger. So I think we're going to put the Stranger and the Steef in... it's between A and B. I'm swaying more towards B. I think that the Stranger is definitely a lot cooler than Munch, but I feel like we get a much deeper emotional connection to Munch than what we do with the Stranger, and I think that's why Munch is placed a tier higher. Next up we have a species called the Glukkons, and you will have only ever seen this species if you've finished Stranger's Wrath, because these only appear right at the end from what I remember, and these are basically like the elite security force that's hired by Secto, the antagonist of the game. And these are a little bit almost disappointing, because their actual design looks really like weird and kind of scary, but the gameplay surrounding them just boils down to them being like another thing for you to shoot at. And I guess that's just a problem that Stranger's Wrath has as a whole. Like, any of the species that are introduced in that game are either just ones that you talk to in a really generic way, or they're something that you shoot at. So it doesn't leave a lot of room for like the intricacies of all of the different species that was possible in like Abe's Odyssey and Exodus. But either way, the Glukkons are interesting because they're actually distantly related to the Glukkons. And it's interesting because the Glukkons are almost like the subordinate species to Secto. And we've been so used to seeing the Glukkons being like the highest up species that we know of, that it's almost a little bit weird seeing it be the reverse of that. And I think that it's a shame that the Glukkons didn't have more scenes in the game, didn't get like explored a little bit more, because most of what we know about them actually comes from like the website and the art books and stuff, and it's not actually in the game itself. And I do actually think that that's a problem with a lot of the Oddworld lore, to be honest. Like, a lot of it isn't actually in the game, a lot of it is just in, like, the surplus material outside of the games, which I don't really like. I kind of wish it was all in the games themselves. But yeah, basically what the Glukkons boils down to is being a really cool design, but in terms of its function in the game, it's just a little bit boring. So I think I'm going to put these in D as well. Next up we move on to the species that Secto belongs to, which is the Octogi. And these are these almost like little squid-like creatures that attach onto other things and sort of take possession of their bodies and like can manipulate them and control them to do their bidding. And it's really interesting because for the entire game, we think that Secto is like quite similar to a Glukkon in terms of his appearance, only almost a little bit more physically capable than what a Glukkon would be because we think he actually has arms. But then at the end of the game, it's revealed what Secto actually looks like, and he is just this squid. And obviously there's the whole thing at the end where it turns out that Secto was attached to one of the last remaining Steef. And that's sort of like kind of a weird plot twist because it doesn't really impact what's happened in the game so far. And it's almost like it was setting itself up for a sequel that never happened, where that was going to be explored a little bit more, which is almost a little bit frustrating that the game ends like that in a way. But yeah, nonetheless, it is interesting, and I would like to see this species explored more in a future Oddworld game. Like maybe they could do something similar to this, where like one of the antagonists of the game, it turns out, is an Octogi, and they could just explore that whole like concept in a little bit more detail. Because I think that is an interesting thing that they could tackle in a better way than how it was handled in Stranger's Wrath. But yeah, because we don't get to see very much of this species in any sort of real detail, I'm actually going to put the Octogi in, I think, I don't think I'm going to put them in D, because I feel like the Octogi have more potential than a lot of the species in D. So I think I'm going to put them in C instead, because I believe that the potential for the Octogi to make a bigger impact on the Oddworld universe is there, but it just needs to be explored more. Now we're moving on to a species called the Outlaws. I would assume that this isn't the actual species name and they're just called Outlaws because that's what they are in the game. So yeah, we don't actually know the like proper species name for these. But they kind of look like, I guess, sort of like a mutated crocodile, I suppose. But not so much so that like it's almost a little bit uncanny in the way that it is with the Clackers. I do kind of like these. With them appearing at the beginning of the game, they almost are more memorable than some of these other inhabitants that were introduced later in the game. They're almost like, they follow that trope of being the bad guys that are like really like stupid and make a lot of mistakes and are easy to take advantage of. But they serve that purpose well. But yeah, I do like these. They all have like somewhat different personalities as well. Like one of them is obsessed with making robots and stuff, which is nice. So yeah, I think that I'm going to rank these like reasonably high. I'm actually going to put them in C. The reason that I'm not putting them higher than that though is because of the game that they appear in. It was like I was saying before, because Stranger's Wrath is just a shooter at the end of the day, it kind of doesn't leave a lot of room to actually properly explore what the species is all about, because at the end of the day you are just like shooting at them and they just boil down to being a moving target for you to aim and pull the trigger at. So yeah, that's a little bit disappointing. Maybe if these appeared in like another Oddworld game, they could be like developed a little bit more. But yeah, for now, they're going in C. Now we have another species in Stranger's Wrath that only appears towards the end of the game, and these are the Wolvarks. So these are like the sort of main security force that have been hired by Secto, and they kind of like simulate like what an army would be in Oddworld, I guess. Like they've got access to all of these like massive weapons like cannons and like attack ships and stuff. So yeah, arguably these are one of the most dangerous species that we've seen in any of the Oddworld games, really, when you think about it, because they seem to have a lot of firepower. But because they only appear at the end of the game, and because they are quite similar to the Outlaws, I just feel like they kind of like blend in with all of the other enemies, and they don't look like that visually distinct either, like the Glockta guy does, for example. So they just end up really like blurring into the background. So because of that, I'm gonna put these things in F. I think they're really, really unmemorable. I think the designs just aren't, like, they just don't stand out enough. And yeah, I just don't really reckon all that much to them. Now I'm going to make this bit really quick, because the next 7 species that we're talking about are all just the ammo types that you collect in Stranger's Wrath. So the Stranger's crossbow on his arm actually doesn't fire like proper ammunition because he doesn't like guns. So instead, he goes down a more natural route and just uses the species of Oddworld as his ammo. So all of the different ammo types have like different effects on the enemies. But because these are treated a lot more just like ammunition than a proper species, I'm actually just going to group them all together and put them in the same rank. So first up we have the Bowlermite. This just webs up the enemies that you shoot it at. We've got the Boom Bat, which just explodes on impact. We've got I think this is the Chipunk, which it makes a loud noise, which like makes enemies go towards it, which then you can obviously like throw out a Boom Bat, which will like hit more than one enemy and cause more damage. So that's an interesting element with Stranger's Wrath, actually, like how you can sort of like combine the ammo types to come up with different tactics. I do think Stranger's Wrath had some like really interesting ideas with that sort of thing, but it still does just kind of boil down to shooting at stuff that you see. Then we've got the Sting Bee, which is basically the machine gun ammo type. We've got the Stunk, which makes any enemy it hits start vomiting so that you can like get a free hit on them, basically. We've got the Thud Slug, which is almost just like the sort of like shotgun ammo type, I guess. Just like really hard hitting, suitable for close range ammo type. And then we've got the Zapfly, which is the only ammo type that has infinite ammo, and it's also the one that I predominantly use because it's like it does a lot of passive damage, because in Stranger's Wrath you can either choose to outright kill enemies or capture them alive, and capturing them alive results in like a bigger reward. So that's what you use the Zapfly for. So once again, this is going in the D tier. And now we move on to the final species, which is called the Sleg. And this thing is distantly related to the Slog. You can probably tell that they look like reasonably similar, with them being dog-like enemies that stand on 2 hind legs and have a very big jaw for eating things. And yeah, I would say that these look pretty cool. And I think that this is one of the more interesting enemies in Stranger's Wrath, because it's reminiscent of one that we've already seen, but because of the different climate, it's just like evolved differently, I guess. And I think that that's something that they could have like done a little bit more. Like they could have had like, I don't know, like I was saying earlier, there could have been a different version of an Elum or something. Feel like a few more like returning species that are like maybe slightly different would have been interesting. But yeah, the Sleg, I think they're pretty good, but just like every other enemy, they kind of just boil down to being shot at. So I'm actually going to put the Slegs in D, just because they're just not very memorable, just because of the game being a shooter, really. It's not their fault, it's just the game that they're in. But yeah, that wraps up the Oddworld species tier list. Let me know if I've forgotten any of them. Obviously, I've missed some of them that were introduced in Oddworld Soulstorm, because like I say, I've not actually got around to like finishing that game yet, so I don't really properly know all of the species from that game yet. So I feel like I can't properly rank them, so I might as well just leave Oddworld Soulstorm out of this. But other than that, let me know if I've forgotten any. I'm fairly confident in saying that I haven't. So yeah, hopefully I've not. But yeah, other than that, give the video a like if you enjoyed it, subscribe to see more stuff like this coming soon, and also leave a comment letting me know if you heavily disagree with any of them that I've ranked. There's got to be someone out there who's like a super fan of Sligs or something that would put them in S rank. But yeah, if that's you, definitely shout out in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!